Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a Little Blue Book. It is Little Blue Book number 1205, and it is titled Thomas Paine's Revolt Against the Bible, written by Joseph McCabe, and it is copyrighted, I believe, in 1927. And we'll begin here with the first chapter. Now, this book I am going to do a cold read on because these books are very brittle. And this one is already falling to pieces as I tried to read it the first time through. So we're going to do this as a cold read. But here we go. Thomas Paine's Revolt Against the Bible. Chapter 1. The Making of a Rebel. There were few heirlooms in my family, but in some dusty corner of an attic was an ancient sword of quaint make, which bore a legend that my pious mother used to say, as in my virtuous boyhood I fleshed it into imaginary pagans, was my grandfather's sword. He once stuck it through the bed of a great villain named Tom Paine. He was in command of the soldiers after Paine, and when he found that the blackguard had escaped during the night, he ran that sword through his bed. No angel whispered to her that the pale, delicate lad at her knees would one day be a worse rebel than Paine, and would defend his memory. She left me the sword, and it hangs honorably on my wall, and I set out to make some satisfaction for the offensive ire of Captain Hill, my great-grandfather, who sought the blood of Paine in the city of London in 1791. It is fitting that we give a whole little blue book to Paine. He stands a monumental figure on the frontier of the old world we are leaving and the new world we are entering. He links more plainly than any the dawning idealism of Europe with the idealism of America. He wrought a great work for America and for the race, and few other rebels against church and state have been so fiercely and vindictively pursued beyond the grave by the hounds of both. Some day historians will compare and contrast the tent-maker of Tarsus and the stay-maker of Thetford, the herald of the dark era of Christ and the herald of the shining era of man, and they may yet frame in an aureole the homely features of the apostle of reason and common sense. By a strange coincidence, on the morning on which I began this book, on October 28, 1926, my paper contains this paragraph. Thetford, Norfolk. Town Council has decided to erect a memorial to Thomas Paine, famous in the 18th century as a social reformer, who was born in Thetford and lived there for 18 years. Less than 20 years ago, I spent a weekend with a parson in a small Norfolk town like Thetford, and not far from it. When I am late and hard-pressed for a sermon, he told me, with a grin, even over the pipe of peace, I pound those atheistic friends of yours, Paine and Voltaire. The people like it. I spoiled his theme by assuring him that Paine at least believed in God more firmly than he did. Already ever sleepy old Norfolk moves. Today Paine is a famous social reformer. In Royal England, tomorrow an atheistic generation may adorn the new memorial with a nightcap and pronounce him grandmotherly and conservative. He will be content. Moncure de Conway, A Fine Life of Thomas Paine, is in its earliest part spoiled by the academic models of biography writing, which my friend Conway followed. It has some laboriously acquired information on things which do not matter, and it fails to explain how Paine became the man of ideals whom we know. He turns up in Philadelphia in 1775 and at once begins to write in the Philadelphia Magazine articles which are instinct with the most human and most advanced ideals then known on the earth. Up to that time he had been a corset maker and a petty excise officer, whence he had got this outfit of ideals which, in that respect, made him superior to Franklin and equal to Deirdre and Condoleezza. Conway does not make it clear. He was born in Thetford on January 29th of 1737. If you wanted to know what church and state and social life were like at their worst in the year 1737, after the birth of the Redeemer of the race, a moving picture of life in Thetford would serve. It was a large village or small town, or about 2,000 souls, as people say, though only the bodies were perceptible, in one of the least advanced counties of Britain. 10 miles away was a cathedral town, Ely. Cathedral towns are still proverbial expressions in England for sleepiness, stuffiness, and clerical tyranny. Centers of Christian influence. Conway quotes a fact of life in Ely in Paine's boyhood. A young wife of 17 had incurred the capital sentence. She was under the shadow, good word, of the venerable cathedral, smeared with pitch, strangled by the hands of the hangman, and burned. Environment, the first clue always. For a student of science, I am old-fashioned. I hardly care a damn about a man's germplasm and ancestors. He will not, naturally, rise above his brain level, but what he does with his brain seems to depend mightily upon his circumstances. Paine's father was a Quaker, and there was a small colony of Quakers in Thetford, although the Quakers were, in their perverse ancestic way, then the finest body of idealists in Britain, and Paine's early ideals were largely Quakerish. This must not be pressed. The mother was Church of England, a sour, unlovely woman, who pleased his hostile biographies by falsely attacking him. He was baptized and confirmed in the Church of England. He was educated at the Church of England grammar school until he was 13. But he was a little Quaker for all that. His boyhood was chilled by the melancholy of their ideal of life. But he learned one or two fine sentiments: peace with all and justice to all, tempered with common sense. Perhaps the clash of Quaker and Anglican parents made him think. The father would quietly scorn all that the mother treasured. Some such contrast led the other great British reformer, Robert Owen, into skepticism in his boyhood, Paine says in his Age of Reason. From the time I was capable of conceiving an idea and acting upon it by reflection, I either doubted the truth of the Christian system or thought it to be a strange affair. I scarcely knew which it was, but I well remember, when about 7 or 8 years of age, hearing a sermon read by a relation of mine, who was a great devotee of the church, upon the subject of which is called redemption by the death of the Son of God. After the sermon was ended, I went into the garden, and as I was going down the garden steps, for I perfectly recollect the spot, I revolted at the recollection of what I had heard, and thought to myself that it was making God Almighty act like a passionate man that killed his son when he could not revenge himself any other way. And as I was sure a man would be hanged that did such a thing, I could not see for what purpose they preached such sermons. This was not one of that kind of thoughts that had anything in it of childish levity. It was to me a serious reflection arising from the idea I had that God was too good to do such an action, and also too almighty to be under any necessity of doing it. I believe in the same manner to this moment, and I moreover believe that any system of religion that has anything in it that shocks the mind of a child cannot be a true system. Common sense stirred in the boy and made him a deist before he was 10. Naturally, his Quaker father would have said much the same, but he must take his word. He says that his parents never talked about religion. He originated his own deism. Common sense was, in fact, the principle of that early phase of skepticism which we call deism. You merely let your common sense play upon the Bible and the Creed, and you pulled it up sharp when it turned to go on to have a word with God. The details of Paine's early career do not really matter much. The experiences would confirm and deepen his childhood impressions. He did not learn Latin at school because the Quakers thought the Latin classics very naughty. He would be taught English from the great 18th century classics, Addison, etc., and his common sense would resent the artificiality of it and lead him to develop the simple style which made him a power. At 13, he was put to the business of making corsets and was 6 years at it. The drab, small world irked him, and he ran away to go to the sea, as adventurous boys then did. His father brought him back, but he ran away again and had a dose of life on the privateer. The strong atmosphere of rum, oaths, and Bible was worse than a Quaker oasis in Thetford, and he went to make corsets and see who wore them in London. There he spent 2 years of the greatest importance, which, I presume, Conway could not trace in detail. Another fine British reformer, George Jacob Holyoake, born in the Provinces, once neatly said, "London, or any metropolis, is the lapidary that polishes the stone sent up from the Provinces." In 1756, London was interesting and stimulating. Only 30 years earlier, the Queen, Caroline herself, had let the world know that she was a deist by refusing the sacrament on her deathbed. The great statesman Walpole, a deist, had told the story with a chuckle. Lord Hervey, the Queen's favorite courtier, again deist, and Lord Chesterfield had published it. The educated world was full of deism. The whole world, noble and common, pious and impious, reeked with what the clergy called vice and enjoyed as much. Preachers now tell their shuddering flocks that Paine drank in Paine's day. Even a preacher could hardly keep his job if he could not drink his 2 bottles at night. As to the drinking, we'll see later. What we do know is that the hope of the race at this time lay in the few sober centers where men cultivated scheme and discussed philosophy, and that young Paines eagerly frequented these centers. He got the taste for science, which later made him acquainted with Franklin, and he found circles openly discussing the questions of religion and philosophy which had arisen in his boyish mind. In Philadelphia, a few years later, Paine would open and scatter what Conway calls a seed bag of ideas. I take it that these 2 years in London were the time when he collected his seed, but we are told very little beyond. The fact that he was zealous for what we call science and what was then broadly called philosophy, the study of nature and man. The further details of his life until he went to America do not really matter much for my purpose. The muckrakers, we will leave them to the last chapter, affect to find sins in his early career, but Conway has finally refuted their libels. Paine did not pose as a Marcus Aurelius in a drunken world. He was poor and struggling, and common sense again, he drank a glass with good fellows to chase away depression. Once, as an excise officer, he was cashiered for entering up work which he had not performed. It was the common practice of his profession, but he had the misfortune to break the 11th commandment instead of the 10th. He was found out. From London, where genius were scarce, he had gone to Dover, then to Sandwich, where he set up as a churchless preacher in the marketplace. It shows 2 things, a really fervent belief in God and a much stricter ideal of conduct, which had most of his fellows. What it was more common to see in an English marketplace at that time was a man merrily putting up his wife, often with a halter round her neck, at auction, before a ribald, beery crowd, and handing her over to some young fellow for $2 or $3, or even 2 or 3 gallons of ale. Paine married in 1759, and his business failed. Took his wife to live at Margate. Her father had been in the excise, and Paine learned the business and got into the service at Thetford. He was, as I said, discharged 4 years later, 1763, for stamping, or making a false report of work. 2 things show that no importance attaches to this. First, he applied for restoration, pleading that there were no charge of either intemperance or dishonesty against him, and his application was granted. Secondly, having to wait some years for a vacancy, he again visited London, and we find him applying for a license as a lay preacher of the Church of England. As I said, London was then thoroughly drunken and frankly sexual, and a young man who thought of such a thing must have been exceptionally religious and virtuous. In 1768, after a few years of teaching and odd jobs, Paine was installed as excise officer at Lewes, in the south of England, and a great smuggling centre. His first wife had died a year after marriage, and he at Lewes married the daughter of his Quaker landlord. The marriage was unhappy and in some respects obscure. They never cohabitated, and after 3 years they separated. Conway says that there was a Quaker custom of avoiding intercourse during the honeymoon, and possibly the bride annoyed Paine by insisting on it. Possibly, on the other hand, he says Paine feared to bring children to spare his poverty. The pay of the excise officer was only about $5 a week. Paine would never tell the reason of his estrangement, and we do not know it. He at the separation treated the wife with a justice and almost unknown in England, relinquishing to her the property she had brought, and often later he anonymously sent sums of money to her. One thing in the Lewes life helped his development. He and others met at night at the White Hart Hotel to have a talk and a glass. The talk offended people because instead of being content to tell each other smutty stories in a decent Christian way, these young folk fell to discussing serious matters like politics and presumably religion. They became known as the Headstrong Club. Paine learned to think in London and to express himself in Lewes, but he lost his job again, a technical offense, and opened a tobacco shop which failed, and in 1774 found himself in financial as well as domestic trouble. He had been something of an agitator, and had been appointed by his fellow excise officers to get a rise in salary for them. He sold up, discharged his debts, and went off again to London. But we will not linger on London. Dipping again into his scientific and philosophical world, Paine met a certain Benjamin Franklin from the American colony, a man already loaded with honors for his scientific and civic services. He had begun his life much as Paine had done, and they talked of America as well as electricity. Yes, he thought Paine would make good in the new country. He would give him a letter of introduction to his son-in-law at Philadelphia, Richard Bach. And, with this in his pocket, Thomas Paine set out in October of 1774 to reach America and fame. And that is the end of chapter 1, and I think we'll stop there, and we'll see you in part 2 for chapter 2. Thanks for listening.